Welcome to the Book of Exodus series on the Town and Field Church podcast. In this 40-day series, one of us at Town and Field will be taking a quick look at one of the chapters of Exodus and sharing some ideas around the text. To learn more about this reading plan and podcast, visit townandfield.ca/reading plans. Now enjoy today's episode.
Hey, it's Ryan, chapter 29 of Exodus. Thanks so much for checking out the podcast again today. I hope the reading has been awesome for you. Chapter 29 of Exodus is all about what's called like the consecration of the priests. So the priests are these like pastoral figures, these spiritual leaders within the community of Israel, and they're being instated now. This idea of consecration, that means to declare that something is sacred or holy. So God is kind of creating this special role and inviting Aaron and his sons and kind of their descendants into this really special role, and it's going to go on for a long time. So there's this big ceremony where they get these different types of loaves together. There's the thick loaf, the thin loaf, and the round loaf, and I'm like, is the round loaf thin or thick, or is it medium, or how's that work? These loaves together, they get a bowl, they get a couple rams. And the rest of the chapter makes me think that maybe part of the priestly role back in the Old Testament was partially just like being a butcher. It's this like pretty bloody picture of these animals being slaughtered, and some of the blood gets put on the altar, and some gets put outside, and some gets put on Aaron and his sons, and on their earlobes, and their thumb, and their toe, and all this stuff. One thing I think that's really cool that we see in Exodus chapter 29 is something that I'm really fascinated with in the Old Testament. That's called typology. Now, I don't have a lot of time to unpack that, but what typology suggests is that so much of the Old Testament is wrapped up in like shadows and foreshadows and basically elements that are going to be fulfilled by Jesus one day. And here we see this blood sacrifice and we see the priest. Two things which the New Testament does a great job. You can read a bunch about the priests in Hebrews, and you can read all throughout the New Testament with this sacrifice where Jesus fulfills both these. He becomes the true sacrifice. We see in verse 14 where the bowl becomes the sin offering to like create this offering for atonement, for forgiveness of the sins of Israel. And there's this perpetual state of sacrificing, but the one true sacrifice, Jesus, comes one day, and he's the sin offering for all. And this isn't offered by arbitrary priests, but Jesus comes and he's the true spiritual leader. He's the one that invites us into this cool relationship. And you see some other kind of interesting things going on where they have these different types of sacrifices. Some they're burning, some inside the holy place, some outside the holy place. They do these wave offerings. In verse 26, it's interesting. It talks about getting them to take the lamb's breast, and God says, this is your share. From now on, you guys will get to eat this, and this will be like your ongoing share. This is what you get. And so this is kind of like their form of payment. The pastor's payment back then was lamb breast, which I'll just say, I'm open to the idea. If you guys are, I like lamb. I'd be happy to just be paid in lamb breast if you guys want to go for that. We also see a kind of like hand-me-down situation going on in verse 29 where it says that Aaron's sacred garments will belong to his descendants. It says ephod, this breastpiece, these turbans and sashes that they're putting on, the caps that Aaron's sons are putting on. They're going to preserve these as these like special kind of garments or pieces that are used in their worship. And again, not that these have some magical power or conjure something up, but they're all this practice of obeying God and symbolizing their reverence to his complete holiness. And then you see in verse 32, where the first church potluck gets instated here, where Aaron and his sons are going to eat together and they're going to partake in kind of the goodness of the sacrifice. And I just love what chapter 29 does for me when I just think about Jesus, our one true priest, and Jesus, our one true sacrifice, sacrificing himself so that as followers of him, in the same way that Aaron and his sons would sit there and feast in the goodness and the provision of who God is, that we as a community of faith, we get to feast in the goodness of who Jesus is. Right now during COVID, it's a little weird because we're not together, and the idea of eating food together seems like something that might not be legal for another decade or 5. But this common sharing we have, we're part of this community of faith just like Israel was. And Jesus, the Lamb of God, lays down his life. And as a priest, as the true priest, he slaughters himself, pours out his blood to offer us forgiveness and grace. And we get to just enjoy the benefits of that. So as you go today, just rest in the assurance that our priest, our sacrifice, is so good and covers over all of our insufficiencies and inadequacies.